I thought I had finally stopped being afraid of the past. I had spent 20 years building a life from the wreckage he left behind. A quiet life of strong coffee early mornings and a house filled with the kind of warmth that only comes from earning every single piece of it yourself. I had raised my daughter alone, watched her become a woman more extraordinary than anything I had ever dared to imagine, and I had told myself, more times than I could count, that we needed nothing from him. What I didn't know, sitting on my porch that warm September morning with my coffee going cold in my hands and the late summer light falling gold across my mother's roses, was that Daniel Marsh had never truly gone away. He had been watching us from a distance, patient and calculating, the way a predator waits at the edge of a clearing, certain of its timing. And now, 20 years after he left me standing in our apartment with a pregnancy test in my shaking hand and a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "I'm sorry, I can't do this," he had come back. Not for me. For my daughter. For everything she was about to inherit. He didn't come back with flowers or apologies or the weight of a guilt he'd carried for 2 decades. He came back with a lawyer, a stack of legal documents, and a fabricated narrative about parental rights he had never once troubled himself to exercise. He came back because my mother had died 8 months earlier and had left Emma, her only grandchild, a house and a substantial trust that would transfer in full on Emma's 20th birthday, exactly 3 months away. Daniel had done his research, he had found the numbers, he had retained a solicitor, and he had decided, with the quiet, unhurried confidence of a man who had always relied on other people absorbing the consequences of his choices, that 20 years of deliberate, total silence entitled him to nothing less than a share of my daughter's future. To understand what happened, you need to understand the life he was trying to reach into. My mother's house sat at the end of a quiet street. Pale yellow white shutters, a front garden she had spent 30 years perfecting. She grew roses along the south-facing fence, pink and white and slightly overblown, which was exactly how she liked them, and a climber called New Dawn that covered the eastern wall every June and filled the whole downstairs with a sweetness that belonged entirely to her. When she died, I kept every part of that garden exactly as she had taught me. Watering her roses on her schedule was the closest thing I had to talking to her. Sometimes, standing at the kitchen window in the early morning half-light with a mug of coffee warming both hands, I could almost convince myself she was just upstairs, still asleep. Emma had been born in February, in the middle of a sleet storm that turned the town white and silent overnight, 7 months after Daniel left. My mother had driven me to the hospital at 3 a.m, her jaw set and her hands perfectly steady on the wheel, and she had held my hand through 19 hours of labor, without once leaving the room and without once saying anything about Daniel that was less than absolutely controlled. She had been the first person to hold Emma after me. She had cried, my mother, who did not cry easily, and said in the low, certain voice she reserved for the things that mattered most, "This one is going to be extraordinary." She had been right. Emma grew into a young woman with her grandmother's gray-green eyes and her grandmother's directness and a serene, practical self-possession that made her seem, at 19, older and cleaner in her judgments than most people I had known at 40. I had built my career around Emma's schedule, around school runs and sick days and the creative freedom of work that could be picked up and put down at the edges of a child's life. I was a translator, Russian, French, and German into English, and over 15 years I had built a clientele that kept me steadily busy without overwhelming me, that let me be present for my daughter in the way I had decided from the very beginning that she deserved. It was not a glamorous life. There were years when money was genuinely tight, years when the loneliness of doing everything alone pressed against my chest in the small hours with a weight that was real and almost unbearable. But it was mine. It was ours. We had built something real together in that pale yellow house, Emma and my mother and I, and Daniel Marsh had contributed nothing to it. Not a school fee, not a birthday card, not a single phone call in 19 years and 8 months. He had been so completely absent that his absence had stopped being a wound long ago and become simply a fact of our landscape. When my mother died that October, she left everything to Emma through a trust managed by her solicitor, Mr. Holloway. The house, her savings, a modest investment portfolio, assembled over 4 decades of careful living. My mother had explained her reasoning years before with the directness she brought to everything important. You've made your own way, Clara. Emma will need a foundation, something that gives her real choices, something no one can take from her. The trust would unlock on Emma's 20th birthday, 3 months away. I genuinely, completely believed that no one could touch it. I had not accounted for Daniel. I had not accounted for the cold, patient arithmetic of a man who had always treated other people's love as a resource to be drawn upon when convenient. The first sign came on a Thursday morning in September, 8 months after my mother's death. I was at my kitchen table with a translation half finished on screen, a legal document, which strikes me now as appropriately ironic, full of dense contractual language I had spent 15 years learning to navigate. The phone rang, an unfamiliar local number. I answered on the third ring, partly because I was expecting a client call and partly because my mother had always answered the phone, on principle, believing that not answering was a form of small cowardice. The voice on the other end was professionally warm and measured, the cadence of someone trained to deliver difficult news in the least alarming register possible. He introduced himself as Mr. Patel, a solicitor. He said he was reaching out on behalf of a client who wished to re-establish contact with his daughter. He said his client believed there were matters relating to the estate of the late Mrs. Eleanor Marsh that required discussion. He did not name Daniel in that first call. He said only that his client was Emma's biological father and that there were legal avenues his client was prepared to explore if direct communication proved impossible. He said all of this in the same smooth, unhurried voice, as though discussing something routine and administrative rather than the opening salvo of a plan to claim a share of a dead woman's love. I sat very still after I hung up. The cursor blinked on the screen. I got up, walked to the kitchen window, and looked out at the roses going to seed at the end of summer, their petals browning and falling in small, pale drifts. I told myself it was nothing. A speculative inquiry with no foundation, the kind solicitors send on behalf of clients who want money and dress it up as connection. I told myself Daniel had no claim, no standing, no rights he had ever once exercised in the entire span of Emma's life. I had been managing everything alone for 20 years. I could manage this. The thought looped quietly, and I let it loop, because sometimes the difference between fear and calm is simply a matter of which thought you give the longer runway. I almost convinced myself. Almost. But the cold at the base of my chest did not entirely go away, and it did not go away for the rest of that day. And that night, I lay awake in the dark, long after Emma had come home and eaten dinner and gone to her room, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence of my mother's house and thought, he found us. 4 days later, a text from my friend Janet on a Sunday afternoon. Saw someone today who said he knew you. Daniel Marsh? Said he'd moved back to town. I didn't like him. 3 sentences. I sat down on the stairs and read them 4 times. Each time the cold in my chest spread a little further. He was here. He was in town. He had introduced himself to someone who knew me, used his own name without hesitation, made himself visible. He was not hiding. He wanted me to know he was back. That was the most important part, that he wanted me to know. Janet had met him at the farmer's market. He had been buying vegetables with the easy, settled air of a man who belonged to the neighborhood. He had recognized her first, said her name warmly, asked how I was doing, whether Emma was well these days. He had said Emma's name, Janet told me on the phone, with an ease that had made her skin crawl, as though he had a right to it, as though he had been keeping a quiet, regular account of us from whatever distance he had maintained for 2 decades. Janet had given him nothing, had walked away as quickly as was polite, but something about the encounter had stayed with her all afternoon, an unease she couldn't name but couldn't set aside. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat on the stairs for a long time afterwards, looking at my mother's old hallway runner, worn thin at the center from 40 years of footsteps, and I thought about how carefully Daniel had timed his return, how he had waited for the grief to pass, for the estate to settle, for the numbers to be clear, and how none of this had anything to do with Emma's well-being and everything to do with Emma's inheritance. He came to the door on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the solicitor's call. 3 measured, unhurried taps at 10 in the morning. The knock of someone who was not nervous, not apologetic, not uncertain of his welcome. I was in the middle of a conference call with a client in Munich. I muted myself, walked to the door, and opened it. 20 years had changed him the way they change everyone. The jaw heavier, the temples gray, the lines around his eyes deeper. But the essential architecture of him was the same, and something in my body recognized it before my mind fully engaged, the way an old scar feels the cold before you consciously register the temperature. He was dressed carefully in a dark jacket and open-collar shirt, studied casual, approachable but considered, the outfit of someone who had stood in front of a mirror that morning and made deliberate choices. He was holding a paper bag from the bakery on Clement Street, 2 roads over. He had bought pastries from a local bakery and brought them to my door as a prop, a small piece of theater meant to suggest neighborliness and goodwill, and a man who was simply, warmly, a part of the same community. It was the most calculated thing I had seen in 20 years, and for just a moment the sheer brazenness of it stopped my breath. He smiled. He said, "Clara, you look wonderful." Low, easy, exactly as I remembered. Designed to be the kind of voice that disarmed you before you decided whether to be disarmed. He said my name the way he always had, slightly elongated on the first syllable, Clara, as though he still had some claim on the sound. I looked at him without speaking. The conference call was on hold in my ear. The roses were dropping their last petals in the garden behind me. My daughter was at university 20 minutes away, completely unaware that the man who had driven away from our shared apartment 20 years ago and never once looked back was standing on her grandmother's doorstep with a bag of croissants and a lawyer's number in his phone. I said, "You need to leave," quietly, without heat. In the precise register I used for things I was absolutely certain about. Then I closed the door and stood with my back against it, listening. His footsteps retreated down the path, unhurried even now, unhurried all the way to the gate, which clicked shut behind him with a small, clean, final sound. I went back to my desk. I unmuted the call. I finished the discussion with Munich in a voice I kept level by force of will alone. And when the call ended, I sat with both hands flat on the surface in front of me and breathed deliberately. In, out for a full 5 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Mr. Holloway. He answered on the second ring. When I explained what the solicitor had said and what Daniel's visit had suggested, there was a short silence on his end, the silence of choosing words carefully rather than the silence of surprise. He said he had already received correspondence from a Mr. Patel. He said the language was assertive. He said I should come in as soon as possible and bring any documentation relating to Daniel's departure and absence. The careful, measured way he said this alarmed me more than anything he might have said directly. I drove to his office the following morning, a gray October day, the sky low and uniform, the kind of morning that feels like a held breath. I sat across from Mr. Holloway's mahogany desk and read the letter from Mr. Patel in full for the first time. 3 pages, very precise. It claimed that Daniel Marsh, as Emma's biological father, had a right to be informed of and involved in decisions relating to Emma's financial future. It referenced the trust specifically and correctly. The numbers, the dates, the terms of transfer. It did not make explicit demands in this first letter. It was too carefully constructed for that. But the shape of what it was building was absolutely clear. This was not an opening inquiry. This was an opening move. Mr. Holloway watched me finish reading. He said, "There's something else." He slid a second document across the desk, a printout of a court filing. Daniel had, 2 weeks earlier, submitted a formal application to be recognized as having parental standing in matters relating to Emma's welfare and financial affairs. It cited the inheritance directly. It cited the absence of any other paternal figure in Emma's life, as though that absence belonged to me rather than to him. It was signed by Mr. Patel and countersigned by Daniel, and my ex-partner's signature. That familiar forward-slanting hand I had not seen in 20 years looked up at me from the bottom of the page like something I had failed to fully bury. My hands did not shake. I noticed this with a kind of distant, precise attention. They were perfectly still on the edges of the paper. Outside the window, the gray October day continued without concern, and inside my chest, something that had been soft for 20 years was turning, very quietly and completely, to iron. How long would this take to challenge? I asked. Mr. Holloway said it depended on what we could establish about the nature and extent of his absence. I thought about the note on the kitchen counter. The apartment I had left 2 months after Daniel did because I couldn't afford it alone. The 19 years and 8 months of silence. Not a birthday card, not a school play, not a phone call, not a response to the single letter I had sent him when Emma was 3 months old. Her name, her weight, her health. The rest left entirely to him. The 0 responses. I have documentation, I said. Driving home, stopped at a red light 3 streets from the house, I finally let myself think the thought I had been holding at arm's length since September. He had come back because my mother died. He had waited 8 months, long enough for the grief to settle, long enough for the estate to be finalized, long enough to get the numbers. And then he had deployed a solicitor and a court filing and himself in person with pastries, like an investment finally being called in. He had never wanted Emma. He had never wanted me. He had come back for £67,000 and a house, and he addressed it in the language of parental connection and a daughter's right to know her father. And he believed, I could feel this in the architecture of the whole approach, that I would be frightened enough, or tired enough, or simply unprepared enough to give him something to make him leave. The light turned green. I drove the rest of the way home in absolute silence. He had miscalculated. He had looked at 20 years of my quiet life and seen someone who could be pushed. He had not understood, not remotely, not even slightly, what 20 years of doing everything alone had made me into. I spent the 3 days after my meeting with Mr. Holloway doing what I had always done when something needed to be managed. I worked. Not on translations. My clients were patient with the vague explanation I gave of a family matter, but on Daniel. On the assembly of 20 years of evidence that he had never at any point been a father to the child he was now claiming rights over. I went through everything I had kept. I am, by training and temperament, a meticulous record keeper. A quality that serves a translator well, the habit of keeping the original alongside the version, of never discarding context. I had kept the note he left. It was in a manila envelope at the back of my filing cabinet, along with the letter I had sent him when Emma was 3 months old. Certified post, return receipt requested, because even then, something in me had understood this might one day need to be provable. The receipt was there, his signature on it, confirming he had received the letter, and then nothing. No response. Not then. Not ever. I laid both documents on my desk and photographed them with my phone, and then I sat back and looked at what they represented, 20 years condensed to a signed receipt and a silence. I had more. Bank statements showing no payments, no transfers, nothing from any account I could trace to Daniel Marsh. Emma's school records, on which the father's section had been blank for 19 years because putting a name for someone who had chosen not to exist felt like a lie I wasn't willing to tell my daughter's school. Her passport application from when she was 7, signed by me alone as sole legal guardian. Her medical records, dental records, every official document in her entire life, with a single parent's name on it. Mine. I put everything in order and drove it to Mr. Holloway that Thursday afternoon. He went through it with focused, unhurried attention, and when he looked up, he said, "This is a very strong foundation, Clara." He said it in the measured way of someone who was not in the habit of making promises he wasn't certain he could keep. He recommended a barrister, a woman named Ms. Adeyemi, whom he described simply as formidable, which was the word I most needed to hear. Emma was at the kitchen table when I got home, laptop open, earphones in, entirely absorbed in something on screen. I stood in the doorway for a moment watching her, the slight frown of concentration, her pen moving in a notebook without her looking down at it. And then I said her name. She pulled out an earphone. She looked at me with those gray-green eyes, clear and waiting. I sat down across from her, and I told her everything, without softening it, without rearranging it into something easier. She was nearly 20 years old, and this was her life, and her inheritance, and her right to know. I told her about the solicitor's call, about Daniel appearing in town, about the pastries on the doorstep, about the court filing and what it was claiming. I told her in a steady voice, with the folder open between us on the table, and I watched her face as she heard it. Emma did not cry. She did not register what I might have expected. Shock, distress, the particular pain of a wound reopened. She listened with complete, unbroken attention, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wants Grandma's money." It was not a question. Her voice was flat and exact, the tone of someone identifying a mechanism rather than expressing an emotion. I said yes. She looked at Daniel's signature at the bottom of the court, filing the way you might look at an insect found somewhere unexpected, with cool, assessing interest, deciding what to do. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I had not been prepared for that. I had been braced, quietly and without admitting it, for grief or confusion or the complicated aftermath of 19 years of absence being suddenly made real. I had not been prepared for her absolute, unruffled pragmatism. I felt something in my throat tighten briefly, and I said, "Ms. Adeyemi may want a statement from you about the nature of your relationship with him." Emma said, "That will be a short statement." She said it without bitterness, without performance, in the same flat, precise voice. Then she put her earphone back in and returned to her screen. The second twist came on a Monday morning, 8 days after Mr. Holloway's meeting, and it was worse than I had anticipated. I had been sent a copy of an additional filing, a supplementary document Mr. Patel described as clarifying his client's position. I read it at my desk with the autumn rain against the kitchen window and felt the steadiness I had carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks begin to shift beneath me. The document claimed that Daniel had been in indirect contact with Emma for the past 2 years. It cited 3 instances of communication through social media, a photography platform where Emma's profile was partially public. It included screenshots. Daniel had sent her messages, 2 she had not responded to, 1 she appeared not to have seen at all. But the document was using these 3 unsolicited messages, sent anonymously to a young woman who had not responded, as evidence of his ongoing effort to build a relationship. It was reframing stalking as paternal outreach, and the language was so meticulous it made my hands curl against the edges of the paper. I called Emma into the kitchen. She looked at the screenshots and said, "I thought those were spam. He didn't say who he was." She set the paper down. Her jaw was tight in the way that meant she was angry and choosing not to be loud about it. "He was hiding on purpose," she said, waiting to see if I'd respond. I called Ms. Adeyemi that afternoon. She'd already seen the filing, she said, with the crisp, energized quality of someone who has found exactly the thread she needed. "He has handed us a gift, Clara. He approached your adult daughter anonymously rather than directly. That speaks to his intent rather than his affection, and any judge will see it." I held the phone and breathed and let her certainty do what it was meant to do. But there was still something unresolved, something I had been circling for weeks without landing on. The question of how Daniel had known the exact terms of my mother's trust, the precise date of the transfer, the correct amount. My mother's estate was not public record. It had been handled through Mr. Holloway's private practice. The accuracy of the numbers in Mr. Patel's letter required a source. I thought about it for 3 days before the answer assembled itself, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the slow, settling way of a translation problem solved by stepping back until the shape of the whole becomes visible. My mother had a younger sister, Aunt Patricia. She had always had a complicated, quiet resentment of my mother's choices. The house, the savings, the will made clearly with Mr. Holloway's help and without consulting her. Patricia had attended the funeral in the front row and wept with the particular demonstrativeness of someone performing grief. And Patricia had been at school with Daniel's older brother. They had stayed in touch, in the loose, occasional way of people who share a town and a history. I called my mother's old neighbor, Mrs. Croft. 82, meticulous memory, no patience for dishonesty, and asked, carefully, whether she had seen Patricia visiting the house after my mother's death. Mrs. Croft said she came twice before the solicitor's letters were even sent, said she was collecting something your mother had promised her. She was on her phone both times, talking quite a while. I thanked Mrs. Croft. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table in the November dark and let the complete shape of it settle. Patricia had given Daniel the numbers. She had waited, carefully and resentfully, for my mother to die, and then had passed along the information to someone she knew would use it. It was not a dramatic conspiracy. It was something smaller and uglier and entirely human. A decades-old resentment finding an outlet, a useful piece of information handed to someone who knew its value. The cold that had been sitting in my chest since September sharpened. I thought about calling Patricia. I decided not to. Some reckonings are better served by silence than by confrontation, and I had something more useful than anger. I had Ms. Adeyemi, and I had the truth, and the hearing was 3 weeks away. The court date fell on a Wednesday morning in late November. Emma wore a dark blue coat and said very little in the car on the way, looking out at the motorway with the focused, conserving expression of someone saving their energy. I drove and did not fill the silence. It was not uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet of two people who have already said everything necessary and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. Daniel was already in the waiting area when we arrived. He was with Mr. Patel, who was younger than his voice had suggested. Sharp-faced, expensively dressed, with the practiced, neutral expression of someone who has learned that showing nothing is the most useful thing. Daniel saw us. He looked at Emma first, a long, involuntary look, the look of someone confronted with the reality of something they had reduced to a legal concept. And for just a moment, something crossed his face that might, in different circumstances, have been read as pain. Then he looked at me, and what was there was something else entirely. Something recalculating. Emma looked at him once, briefly with no particular expression, and then looked away. She took out her phone and read something. She did not look at him again. The hearing itself was less dramatic than 20 years of imagined confrontation had prepared me for, which is, I have come to understand, the nature of actual justice. Miss Adeyemi was precise and unhurried. She presented the documentation, the note, the certified letter with its return receipt, 19 years of absence in every official record of Emma's life. She presented Emma's written statement, factual, direct, entirely without sentiment, stating that she had never had a relationship with the applicant, had never sought one, and did not wish to have one, and that she was fully capable at 19 of making that decision for herself. Ms. Adeyemi noted, without elaboration but with perfect timing, the nature of the social media contact, the anonymous approach, the non-responses, the absence of any attempt at genuine identification. Mr. Patel made his case well. He spoke of a father's right to know his child, of choices made 20 years ago by a young man who had since changed, of the complexity of family and the importance of connection. The judge was a woman of about 60, with short gray hair and the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has heard every version of this argument many times and has developed over decades an accurate radar for the difference between genuine longing and financial calculation dressed in sentimental language. She listened to everything. She asked Emma one question directly. "Do you wish to have a relationship with the applicant?" Emma said, "No, just that." One word perfectly clear, with no apology attached to it. The judge dismissed Daniel's application in full. She said, in the measured language of formal rulings, that the application lacked any foundation of prior relationship, that the applicant had demonstrated no history of financial, emotional, or practical support, and that the beneficiary was a legal adult fully capable of determining her own familial relationships. She said there was no basis on which the applicant could claim standing in matters relating to the estate. She said it without drama, in the same measured voice she had used throughout, and then it was over. We walked out into a gray November afternoon, Emma and I. Ms. Adeyemi moved away to take a call. I stood on the pavement outside the building with the cold air on my face and the particular, specific silence of something genuinely finished. Emma was looking up at the sky with her hands in her coat pockets, and her expression was one of calm, complete relief that she was, characteristically, not making into a performance. She said, "Do you want to get lunch?" And I laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than amusement. And she looked at me with a small, private smile that was entirely her own. Daniel did not look at either of us as he left the building. He walked to his car with the particular posture of a man who has been publicly and completely wrong about the resources he thought he had, and who is rearranging, as he walks, the story he will tell himself about why. I watched him for just a moment. I thought about the note on the kitchen counter 20 years ago. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." And I thought about everything that sentence had required me to become, and I felt something I can only describe as gratitude. Not toward him, toward the version of myself who had read that note and wept for a week and then stood up and fed herself and found a flat she could afford and driven herself to the hospital in a sleet storm at 3 a.m. and built an entire life without him. He had miscalculated who I was. He had miscalculated who Emma was even more. She was not an inheritance waiting to be claimed. She was not an asset with a transfer date. She was 20 years of deliberate daily love, made solid and specific, and entirely her own. Emma's birthday fell on a Saturday in February, as it always had, in the particular midwinter brightness that sometimes comes between storms. The light low and gold and clean. Mr. Holloway called that morning to confirm that the trust had transferred in full. Emma was at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee when I told her, and she nodded, exactly once, in the manner of someone receiving news they had been correctly confident of all along. In the afternoon, we drove to the garden center together and bought a new climbing rose for the eastern wall, a variety Emma had chosen herself, which the label described as having a scent something like the original New Dawn. We planted it together in the cold, clear air, pressing the soil down around the roots with our hands, working in the easy, unhurried rhythm of people who have done difficult things together and do not need to discuss them. That evening, I sat on the back step with a glass of wine while Emma cooked inside and the kitchen lights made the garden glow. I thought about my mother saying something no one can take from her and understood that she had not only been talking about money. She had been talking about this, the house, the garden, the warmth of the kitchen window, Emma's voice, a new rose in the ground. She'd been talking about the specific gravity of a life built from love rather than from claim. The new dawn would take 2 summers to flower properly, but it was there, rooted and growing, and it was entirely ours.